Hey everyone, so in my last video I focused on talking about dwarf trees and their pros and cons. And just to quickly summarize, what I said was that I think dwarf trees that are often used to make sort of pre-made bonsai that you can buy in stores and stuff, that dwarf trees have their advantages, like that they're fairly attractive and kind of automatically sort of look like a bonsai without doing a lot of work to it. But on the other hand, they have other drawbacks, like they don't create really high quality bonsai really quickly because they're so slow growing that it takes a long time, for example, for the trunk to get big and thick and interesting. So what I want to do today is I wanted to really sort of critique the hell out of a pine tree that I've got. And I want to talk about some of its good attributes and its bad attributes, with the goal being to try to teach you a little bit about some of the principles of what we look for in bonsai and how to correct problems. So this is the tree that I'm going to be critiquing today. This is a kind of Mugo pine. Mugos are used very commonly as bonsai. This was a plant that I got just at a regular nursery. And so I want to point out a couple of things right off the bat. Remember last video I showed you an example of a dwarf tree that had just sort of a spindly little trunk. And I want you to look at the trunk on this. Now, I don't know how old this tree is. It may not be a whole lot older than the dwarf elm that I showed you last time. But notice how much thicker this trunk is. While that one was more like a twig that was thinner than my finger, this is way thicker than my finger. And that's partly because it's a variety of tree that grows faster, more vigorously. And also it may be because it's slightly older. It also may have had more space to grow in a larger pot. The point is that when you get stuff out at a nursery, oftentimes that's probably going to be better material for you to work with, because the material you get at a nursery is from trees that are usually faster growing. They've often been growing in bigger pots, and so they have already fairly big trunks. Let me show you another example of what I'm talking about. This is another kind of pine. This is a kind of Scots pine, and look how thick that trunk is. You know, that's a couple of inches across. And this is a tree that, again, I just got at a nursery. You know, it was relatively cheap, and yet it's already got this really thick trunk partly because of the species, the variety of tree that it is, but also that it had probably a larger pot to grow in for several years. And so the point is that you can start out way ahead when you're starting with nursery material that often already has a thick, interesting trunk to it. And like I said in the last video, that's maybe the hardest thing to get right in a bonsai, is a good trunk. Let me talk a little bit about what's right and what's wrong with this trunk. So let's start at the bottom. If we look at the bottom of the trunk here, notice that the trunk just sort of transitions very neatly, cleanly into the dirt. It just sort of goes right down straight into the dirt like that. That's not a very good quality. It shows that this tree does not have what we call a nebari, which is a word for the area around the base of the trunk where the roots would start to flare out from the base of the trunk. And that nebari is a very valuable attribute of a good bonsai. It makes a tree look very old and weathered, and is just aesthetically pleasing. This tree does not have a nebari of much note. I tried to scrape around the bottom of the trunk here with my finger, because sometimes what you'll find is that there are some interesting roots and nebari that's sort of buried under the dirt, and you just can't see it without taking your finger and scraping away the dirt and seeing what's there. In this case, it doesn't seem to have anything interesting below the surface, and that is probably partly an attribute of just this being a pretty young tree. So over the years, a nebari may form that's more interesting, one can hope. But that's one of the not so good things about this tree. The trunk itself, if we go up a little bit, has this sort of weird kind of bump here from a limb that was cut off at some point, and so this part is sort of bulging out as it's sort of calloused over the wound, and so this part here looks really thin and so you got this sort of odd looking sort of bulge. That's not a great quality, but again, as the tree matures, gets older, that may change and the proportions may change, and it may sort of look a little more normal as things progress. What I like about the trunk is that it already had this sort of natural curve to it when I bought it. So if you see it, it has this sort of slight S curve to it. It's not too extreme. It doesn't look bizarre. It looks fairly natural, and indeed it is natural. I didn't create that. As we talked about in the last video, trunks are really hard to change once they're in place. It can be really difficult to give a straight, boring trunk an interesting look to it. It may be possible, but it may take years of gradual changes that you make to it over time. So I felt sort of lucky that this one already had sort of a nice, graceful little curve there. It also has a decent taper to it. So it's fairly thick down here. It gets a little narrower as the trunk goes up, which is what you would expect in a natural kind of tree, and it's good to see that. I mean, sometimes you do see sort of weird trees that have weird bulges and what's called an inverse taper, where it's actually sort of narrower towards the bottom and thicker towards the top. That's usually not attractive. So in this case, we have a fairly standard taper here, and that's a good thing. Let's look at the branches. One of the things that I like about this tree is that the branches are thin enough that I can still bend them. So if you'll notice, I've got wire around most of these branches, and that's to help me to give them a more of a bend. And they're thin enough that I can do that. Now, some people may make fun of my wiring, and that's fine. I don't care. I don't typically worry about how pretty my wiring is. I just want it to do the job. So I've got this branch bent down at a downward angle. That helps to give the impression that it is an older branch, because old branches tend to sort of dip down through the weight of their leaves and branches and just the process of aging. And so it gives the illusion that this branch is an old branch, and I've done the same thing over here. Another thing that I've done is, although it's kind of hard to see, is that through the wiring I have made the branches, given them sort of an S shape. I've given them a curve shape using the wiring so that they're not just straight. And the reason for that is because by giving them a little curve, not only does it make it look a little more interesting, but it also shortens the branches a bit. So part of the problem with these branches was I thought they were too long and straight when I first got the tree. And so by taking the wire and creating little curves in the branch, it has the effect of compacting the branch, making it appear shorter, and that's a little more aesthetically pleasing. Another thing I like is that the placement of the branches is nice and staggered. So for example, if you notice, we go up the trunk, here's a branch here, then we go up a little further, and here's another branch. Now these two branches are not side by side, they're not symmetrical, one on each side of the trunk. You've got one on the left, and you go up a little further, one on the right. We go up a little further, we got one on the left, we go up a little further, we got one on the right. That sort of staggered offset branch arrangement is fairly traditional and is naturally pretty aesthetically pleasing. As opposed to, for example, what if this branch wasn't here at all and we had two branches on the left and then a third branch on the right. With this branch gone, it might look a little weird. It would look sort of, the tree would look a lot heavier on one side than the other side. And if you have two branches that are symmetrical, one directly on the other side of each other, that's also a look that is typically not very aesthetically pleasing. I think because in older trees, you see a lot more asymmetry in an older tree, again because of age and all of the challenges that tree has had to get through in order to grow and survive. Old trees are rarely highly symmetric. They've got bends to them, and they've got some damage, and they've got one branch that's a lot bigger than another branch, and so that variability in the branch arrangement where the branches are staggered and not side by side, gives the illusion again that the tree is older than it actually is. Now, let's talk about the top. The top is a problem. As you can see here, what I've got is branches at the top, and just two little spindly branches at the top, and it looks kind of weak up here. This is a tree that has a pretty poor apex. The apex is just the top of the tree. That's what the apex is. And because this is a fairly young tree again, it just hasn't had enough time to grow much of an apex. And fortunately, that's a good problem to have. And let me explain why. By not having much of an apex, all I have to do to correct that problem pretty much is to just let the tree grow and not mess with it. So I'm not going to prune the new growth at the top here. I'm just going to let it go, because the tree is naturally going to put a lot of energy and vigor into the top. And so over the next few years, this will get bigger and fuller. The more common problem that you see in trees, especially as they get older, is you'll see a lot of foliage at the top, and the bottom branches tend to have not very much foliage at all. They look very bare. And that's because with all the foliage at the top, sunlight has a hard time reaching the bottom branches, and so the needles or the leaves just start falling off, and they look just sort of bare and kind of sickly. That's a harder problem to fix. You can fix it depending on the variety of the tree that you're working with. If you prune off a lot of that top mass and allow for sunlight to reach the bottom branches, they may come back. You may get more vigor in those lower branches, but it depends on the variety of tree that you're working with. And fortunately, these Mugo pines, this Mugo pine it has a really easy time budding back. And by budding back, what I'm talking about is it puts out new growth on old wood. So if you can see, for example, right here, that little bit of branch right here that's growing, that's just new this year. That wasn't here last year. And again, that's budding back. It's growing, putting out new growth on old wood instead of just new growth on the tips of the branches like out here. So a variety of tree that easily buds back, stands a better chance of being able to kind of regrow the old growth and make it look fuller again. But again, having a weak apex is a relatively easy problem to fix. My plan is that over the next few years, I'm going to allow the top to grow, and I will try to, at some point, I'll be trying to shape it into a triangle shape. Try to imagine sort of a triangle shape at the top here, and that may take 3 to 5 years or something to start to emerge. But that's less time to develop a nice looking tree than it would take if we were still working with that dwarf elm that I showed you last time. That tree, like I said, could take maybe decades to develop a thick enough trunk that it would look like a real old tree, just because it's such a slow grower. This Mugo pine is a much faster grower, and so you're going to get much greater thickening of the branches and larger leaf pads, foliage pads, not leaf pads, but needle pads in a faster period of time. And that's one of the advantages of working with sort of standard nursery stock. One of the reasons why I think people avoid dealing with nursery stock is that oftentimes you have to kind of take it back down to the basics and then rebuild it. And a lot of people don't have the patience for that, and they don't have the vision to see what the tree could become in several years. They want something that looks good right away, and they don't have the patience. Let me give you an example of what I mean. So let's move this aside for a second. I'm going to bring this pine over again. So again, when I first got this, this was, I don't know, this was 2.5 feet tall when I first got it. And unfortunately, the branches were they were so far apart and they were so leggy. I kept trying to find a way to make it work, but I couldn't come up with a good idea. So what I wound up deciding to do was I cut the top of the tree. So the top, say 2/3 of the tree, I cut off. I've sharpened and cleaned up the top there, made it look a little like a gin sort of a natural piece of damaged wood that gives it an attractive kind of look. So I did that, and the advantage of doing that is now I've got this really thick trunk, which again is a really hard part to develop, and I can now sort of clear the slate as far as the branches go, and I can focus on branch development over the next few years. So this tree right now only has this one branch. It doesn't look all that great, I admit that. But again, this is where patience comes into play, and the ability to sort of look 3 years, 5 years ahead in the future and see what it could be. So what my plan is I'm just going to let these branches grow, and over time I'm going to develop them into separate foliage pads to give it an older, aged look. And over time this branch will thicken, and it will look a little more natural. And so you just have to kind of envision what it could be. Again, notice that I've taken wire and I've bent this branch. I've given it a curve here, an interesting curve, because otherwise it was just straight. It wasn't doing anything interesting, and that also helps create the illusion of age, gives it a little more character. So I hope that for beginners that this was a sort of useful talk about trees and what are some of the qualities that we look for in a good bonsai and how to fix problems. Again, I think one of the main lessons is I think for new people coming on board, they often look for trees that automatically look like a bonsai right off the bat. And I want you to try to expand your thinking about that. Oftentimes some of the best stuff is stuff that doesn't really look like a bonsai right as you look at it, but it could in a few years if you work with it. And oftentimes that means taking a tree, an older tree, a nursery stock tree, a tree that is in someone's yard that they don't want anymore, and you dig it up and you eliminate most, if not all, of the branches, so that you bring it back down to that nice old looking trunk. That's the heart of your tree, and then start thinking about how you're going to bring it back and redevelop those branches, because redeveloping the branches is relatively quick and easy to do. It's the trunk that's hard. Hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments section.